Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the session about supply chain and 5G security. And as I see, the clock is ticking and we have just 25 minutes as we have to leave the room before the next session starts. I would like to kick it off right away. My name is Pernik. I'm from CCDCOE, and I'm happy and privileged to have with me Mr. Manfred Boudreaux-Dehmer, if I pronounce now correctly.
Perfect.
And he's a NATO CIO and CISO, and he has this unique expertise that Kim talked about as he nicely bridges the gap of IT leadership of 25 years, experience from both startups and multinational corporations, including in Europe, United States, Canada, and Brazil. And nicely has worked also as a programmer and in a company providing wireless IoT and 5G solutions. And on top of that, he holds 2 master's degrees, and he's currently a doctorate candidate and research associate at the University of Reading, examining human-machine interactions within the context of IoT. So without further ado, let's start first from supply chain and then we move to 5G. So why is it important? Let me start with a couple of statements. Many speakers today and yesterday mentioned supply chain security and vulnerabilities. And clearly not only ransomware and 5G, but also supply chain has become a national security concern. And this is illustrated by the high-profile supply chain attacks and public attribution by the EU, Ukraine, Five Eyes, and others, among others, NotPetya, SolarWinds, and most recently in Ukraine, the CASAT attack, which, by the way, was also supply chain, as the initial intrusion happened through ground-based network, which was operated by a subsidiary of Eutelsat, which already notoriously got some reputation this morning. And at least one Viper was also delivered by a third-party software supplier. Also, as for the background, then EU and US Trade and Technology Council, and as well as Quad Cooperation, have promised to align their security standards of software supply chain for government purposes. So it's seeing those actions at the international level. So just to throw in some data points, this is not surprising because according to industry reports, supply chain attacks have increased 300% last year over 2020, and per Verizon recent report, 62% of intrusions last year took place through supply chain. Moreover, per ENISA's recent report, more than 50% of attacks are conducted by APTs. And of course, it's not surprising because as organizations get better and better in harnessing their networks, then supply chain attack vector offers very good, so to speak, door because it's stealthy, scalable, and offers privileged access both to on-premise and cloud environments and hybrid environments. So we see that those attacks are often targeted and costly and complex, and usually take quite a long time for planning. For example, SolarWinds attacks, according to reports, took at least 6 months for preparation until the malware was deployed. On the other hand, we heard about zero trust policy, S-bombs, but those as well don't mitigate all the supply chain risk. And an example is Log4j or Log4Shell, which I have heard SBAM would not help to mitigate, and many organizations have still difficulty to actually identifying those software dependencies on open source. So with that little background, my first question, Manfred, to you is, as you are overseeing 41 sites in NATO and in NATO enterprise and 25,000 people, so what is your role and your office role, which I understand is pretty new, established in September last year, in securing supply chain, and in particular, as we know that ENISA has published threat assessment and guidelines, there are NIST guidelines, and many governments have similar. So what is NATO doing? Do you have your own kind of certification or standardization and or policy, and how do you approach this?
Well, Piret, thank you so much for the very warm introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I think there are 5 questions in that question, so let me just kind of unpack it a little bit. So as Piret mentioned, I started at NATO last year in September. Before that, I was in the private industry, worked for Canadian telecommunications company, 5G, IoT, Pioneer for 11 years, and before that HP and Compaq, so lots of private industry experience. The question on, okay, so what is it that the CIO does at NATO? So there's 2 legs to my job. And one leg is looking after enterprise coherence. And the enterprise, as you mentioned, it's 41 more or less entities. That's kind of the inner part of NATO, which is the bi-strategic commands, Allied Command Operations, Allied Command Transformation, the different agencies that we have, parts of the NATO headquarters. So it is basically everything that is NATO that's not the alliance or the federation, which would be our member nations and the partners. And so that's about total count of 25,000 users, 41 entities. And so one thing that we do is looking after IT coherence, that we approach portfolio management, architectural decisions, service level considerations in a harmonized way across the 40 plus entities of NATO. And then the other part is to be the single point of authority for cybersecurity for the NATO enterprise and the enterprise risk owner. And so with that, let me get to the question of, kind of from a policy perspective. So there is so the policies at NATO are really set by the nations, right? And there are a number of committees that are operating underneath the NAC, the North Atlantic Council, which is the top-level governance body, of course, of NATO. And the committees that are most active in this space is the C3 board, the consultation command and control board. That's essentially a collection of IT professionals. And then it is the Cyber Defense Committee that's also very, very active in that space, right? And so policy governance is being set at the board level. And what we're looking for is implementing those policy or government decisions to the best of the NATO enterprise. So we're kind of the guardians of the cohesiveness from an IT perspective in the enterprise, as well as making sure that the NATO enterprise is as secure as it can possibly be. Did that answer?
Yes. I trust, of course, that there are issues that you cannot touch here in this format, but I would assume that things we heard during the industry presentations, such as various equipment for improving network detection, such as also regarding the supply chain, are used, as well as threat intelligence sharing and so on. Mm-hmm. But let me, as you mentioned, NATO as an alliance, let me ask about the nations. Do you have this bird-eye view over 30 nations and the national level? Because my understanding is that during NATO operations, also national CIS is connected to NATO enterprise, NATO network. So basically the threats would mitigate from one or transfer from one to the other. So is there a common view in NATO about common approach to supply chain security and policies and standards? And I'm here thinking about various measures that, for example, the ENISA has proposed, or some governments like US government, for example, nationally, such as various more technical measures, certification, auditing, testing, verification, etc. Is there a common approach, or each nation? And of course, if we talk about that, then there is a concern about discrepancies, and some nations are lagging behind, and which will have implications to interoperability, because we would like to see the common baseline security level. For example, a couple of years ago, NATO announced that we have agreed to baseline security requirements for telecommunications. Mm-hmm. So we are now already shifting to 5G soon, but regarding this aspect, do you see there is more need to harmonize those, or are we content where we are at the national level?
Okay, so again, about five questions in the one question. So the answer is yes and yes. So, so are we at a place where we do have standards and interoperability and those considerations? The answer is yes, but there is always a pathway to do more. Right. So let me touch a couple of tenets here that are in your question. So one is interoperability, which is hugely important for NATO. Obviously, right. You can only pull the string into the same direction if you work on the same standards, right? And that is true across the alliance as well as partners, right? So the way how we exchange information and work on common systems needs to be harmonized. And there's a couple of areas that play in this field. One is the NATO Office of Standardization that sets the STACNACs and that the nations subscribe to and are working with. Then there is also, specifically on the cybersecurity side, there's a lot of interaction that takes place. So we learn a lot from each other, which should not be surprising, right? Because there's a lot of knowledge that are with the allies and also within the NATO enterprise, and a lot of exchange of information that's happening there through a couple of different forums. And so, yeah, it's, and there's always an ongoing conversation about how can we make this better. So there is never, I think, a situation of complete interoperability, complete exchange of information, right? It's always going to be an evolving field, particularly since also very soon I would expect for us to have 2 new allies, right? And that needs to be brought up to that level again. So it's a work in progress. Thank you.
Now, shifting gears to 5G, which I understand is also your area of expertise. So we heard in the last session about new risks from virtualization, softwareization, etc., which Kim Hartman described nicely, including software supply chain issues, because these are implicated also in 5G. But it was also talked about how many security enhancements 5G offers compared to the previous generations. But one of the reasons that military will benefit if of course, is because it enables to connect sensors to decision makers and enhances situational awareness and speeds the decision making. So, as well as various military applications such as AR, VR, IoT, also smart logistics, smart warehouses. And I know NATO NCA is leading a multinational 5G collaboration project, and various nations are experimenting and prototyping with those 5G use cases. And just recently read the news that Lockheed Martin and Microsoft had experiment where they linked Link 16 to Microsoft Cloud, so that was interesting. And we, in our center, we also run a couple of workshops on 5G military security. And one of the ideas that was floating around there was that NATO should start thinking about 5G strategy, because you already have a data policy, AI strategy, and so on, and we do need to have some kind of principles in terms of reliability and security, but also in terms of where are the directions, what are those use cases. So what is your take on this, that are there specific use cases that nations should develop? And because let's be honest, building private 5G networks, it's very resource
expensive.
Expensive, yes. Thank you. So, so could you a little bit elaborate on that? That what is your view? Do nations need some kind of joint vision, plan in terms of using the benefits of 5G?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of obviously 5G initiatives that are ongoing with the allies. It was just last week that we had the C3 board that I referred to earlier, the plenary, with an excellent presentation from one nation about their activities in that field. And I think what you will find is that among 30 nations, there are some that are more active in the 5G space, and others are maybe a bit less active or still watching as to what's going on there. So I think there's a lot of communication and again, learning from each other as to where different nations stand. And then the other part of your question, I think, is towards NATO itself, right? Because as a NATO enterprise, we can benefit hugely from 5G. And we have, and there's also two parts to it. I think one is kind of standards and a strategy. And I think we're on the way to getting there. There is a 5G conversation that's ongoing internal to the NATO enterprise as to what do we want to do, what kind of use cases do we want to test. The type of use case itself is probably not even that important as long as it's an end-to-end use case, right? That really looks at the technical aspects of a 5G solution, really from the network into the application, but also looks at open architecture, looks at security, looks at what can we learn from it from an end-to-end perspective, right? And so yeah, so 5G, we're still early in the game, you know, lots of good conversations, lots of exchange of, you know, what different allies are doing in the 5G space. And I think as a NATO enterprise, we're also going to be a player in that field, and it's going to come over time.
Yes, so we still have almost 6 minutes left, so we do want to take audience questions, but before doing that, please prepare. I wanted to come back to those military applications, and one of the recommendations of our own report was that because free GPP standards don't include, some of those are voluntary to implement for MNOs, and they don't include maybe sufficient security controls for the military. So is your view that, and also Kim mentioned that everything should be security by design, and with 5G we have this opportunity now. So how can NATO and military actually make sure that those military-grade security requirements are considered by commercial providers who are sitting in those standardization organizations? And
that's a great question, and we only have 4 minutes or so left. We probably need 40 minutes for that. So how could NATO ensure that that the standards are that they reflect really what the sensitivity of the information requires, right? And then that the standards are adhered to. And then also, I think more importantly, that the solution that's being provided adheres to the standards. So I think there's really 3 things in there. So one is we're not we don't make laws. NATO does not make laws, right? We're different from the European Union in that we're not a legislative body, obviously, right? So we're working with other organizations on furthering the discussion about 5G. And the second thing is transparency with suppliers who would be building solutions, that we start early on, secure by design, but that we have decision makers early at the table to look at how would the standards apply to the solutions that are being built. And then you mentioned Kim's presentation earlier, which was fascinating in terms of how do you actually test and how do you validate that the solution that's provided adheres to the standard. And I think that is that's a conversation where I don't have an easy answer. I think there is an analysis that needs to be done as far as how we accredit systems. Right now, it's a pretty serial process in terms of a solution is being built. And at the end, there is a security review of the solution. And I think this needs to change, particularly as we get into those agile development cycles, right, where things kind of go faster and faster. And I think the validation of the standard and the accreditation of a system needs to also follow in an agile fashion, kind of like one building block with the next building block. So I almost see it like as a tile arrangement rather than one block. You know, a supplier builds the solution and then we kind of test it and accredit it afterwards.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, and I still wanted to ask about Diana and how we can leverage this for the 5G experimentation, but I want to give the chance to audience. If we have any questions, then we can answer them. There is one, please, gentlemen.
Thank you. Michael Baitra, Masaryk University in Brno and Accenture Security Europe. So yesterday's topic was, especially for keynotes, was really about the importance of cooperation and public-private partnerships. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to ask you, considering your extensive private sector experience, what are the major challenges that we still need to overcome, and what are the things that we need to improve for us to be able to really cooperate between the NATO or the public sector in general and the private sector? Thank you.
Let me see if I can answer that in 90 seconds. And it ties into your Diana question, right? Because that really is a public-private academia, what we call the triple helix of innovation. So how can we best make this work? And I think we can best make it work through ongoing communication, right? And exchanging as to what is important for each party. Is coming in from the private industry into NATO, I see that the governance structure is very different from the private sector. I see that the speed to delivery is quite different from the private sector as well. And so it's basically an exchange of information in an ongoing dialogue as to how this partnership works, and also what is the reason why things at NATO take long. I mean, we have 30 member nations, right, that we serve. And we are a consensus-based organization, so that means that really we agree, and to reach agreement and to have the consultation process in place, is a lengthy process, and so that's sometimes maybe not fully understood by the private industry, and I think that's where a lot of information exchange and fits in.
Yes, so I think Jan, a question will be left for coffee break. So
yes, see me in the coffee break.
That's all what we have time for. So big applause to a very interesting discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Piret. Thank you.